then spent the evening playing board games and cards, then watching How the Grinch Stole Christmas, both the half-hour cartoon version and the movie version because Zoe loved both, and so did Riley. She and Zoe snuggled together on the sofa, laughing at the Grinch, then feeling bad because he was misunderstood. As Zoe scooted closer and held Riley's hand, it occurred to her how much she'd missed out on, and how much she craved a family of her own someday. Or now. Family. She fell into it and welcomed it for as long as she had it. This wasn't her family. Zoe wasn't her daughter, and Ethan wasn't hers to keep. After Christmas, she had to head back to Nashville, and Ethan and Zoe's lives were here. She couldn't have everything. There were no television cameras, no photographers, and as Ethan watched Riley snuggled up on the sofa with his daughter, his heart clenched. Riley had scooped her hair up into a ponytail, kicked off her boots, and thrown a blanket over her and Zoe, both of them yawning as they watched television. She'd wriggled into his family as if she belonged there, as if she'd never left. She threw Brody's zingers right back at him, ignored Wyatt's bad moods, and helped out with cooking and serving dinner and then the dishes, never once acting as if she were a superstar or a diva. And then she'd sat on the floor cross-legged and played with his daughter, for hours, not out of any sense of obligation, but as if she'd truly enjoyed playing with a 7-year-old. They'd done puzzles, sang together, read together, played dolls, and even make-believe fairies. Riley hadn't once acted as if it were a chore to play with his kid. She'd seemed to be having a great time with Zoe. Now they curled up together on the sofa watching a movie. Riley stroked Zoe's hair as his daughter's eyes drifted closed, and so did Riley's. They looked comfortable together, right together, as if they belonged to each other. Shit. He was making something out of nothing. Riley was being polite, was being herself, and Zoe had a monster case of hero worship, though she didn't take to women all that well. Ethan had tried dating a few times, had included Zoe once or twice, and while Zoe was friendly, she didn't have mad love for the women like she did with Riley. And despite Riley's star status, he didn't think Zoe would be snuggled up against her like this if she didn't have feelings for her, considering Zoe's bullshit meter and all, which was outstanding. The kid just knew whether someone genuinely cared or not. Which was just making the fact Riley would leave them both even harder. He should separate them before his daughter got hurt. He could handle it. Zoe wouldn't understand it. Coward that he was, he went into the kitchen and grabbed a cup of coffee and found his mother pulling down plates from the cabinet. "Let me help you." He reached the top cabinet and pulled the plates down. "Thank you. And why aren't you in there watching television with Riley and Zoe?" "They're both asleep, or almost asleep." "Oh, how sweet. Zoe really likes her." "Too much, I think." His mother frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means when Riley leaves town it's going to hurt her. I need to put a stop to the two of them getting any closer." She put her hands on her hips. "Don't you dare, Ethan Kent. I never thought of you as a coward before." He backed up a step. "What do you expect me to do, Mom? Riley will be leaving after the holidays, and by then Zoe will think she can keep her." "Oh, I see." She pushed the plates to the side and pulled out a chair, then pointed to another. Ethan sat. "We're not really talking about Zoe now, are we?" "Yes, we are." "Okay, we're not talking only about Zoe. You're afraid for your own heart, too." He shrugged. "I'm a big boy. I can take it. She's just a kid. She won't understand." "You still love her." "I've always loved her. I never stopped." She laid her hand over his. "It's okay to feel that way. Have you told Riley how you feel?" "What good would that do? She still has to leave." "But you never told her before. Maybe it's time you do. Maybe it'll make a difference." He laughed. "No, it won't." See, that's always been your problem, Ethan. What's my problem? Guilt. It's been your best friend for so long, you don't know how to live without it. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? First, it was guilt over the whole Amanda thing. It kept you from seriously trying to find Riley. Then, it was Amanda's pregnancy, so you ended up staying married to her when maybe you shouldn't have. If I hadn't stayed married to Amanda, I wouldn't have Zoe. That's true, and we're all grateful for Zoe. But what about what you want, Ethan? I have everything I want. No, you don't. And you're once again going to let guilt decide for you. You felt guilty for letting Riley down. You're still feeling guilty about it, and it'll keep you from thinking you're good enough to ask her to stay. It's not the same thing at all this time, Mom. Isn't it? You're going to let her go without letting her know how you feel. To me, it's the same thing. I need to take her home. His mother nodded, then stood and came over to him, wrapped his face in her hands. I have faith in you, Ethan. I think it's time you had faith in yourself and what you have to offer. I can't compete with what she already has. Her eyes twinkled as she smiled. Can't you? She kissed his cheek and let him go. When he walked into the living room, his heart turned over at the sight of Riley's head lying on top of Zoe's, both of them sound asleep. And then he thought about what his mother said. Riley was going to spend the holidays alone. She had no family. How many Thanksgivings and Christmases did she do that? What must that be like for her, to send her crew home to their families, then go home to an empty house for the holidays? Ethan had his mother, father, brothers, and he had Zoe. He was wrapped up in the warmth and love of family surrounding him not just at the holidays, but every single day of his life. As he looked down at Riley and Zoe huddled together, he realized maybe there was something he had to offer. But would Riley even want that? Maybe she was content with the life she'd created for herself. He swept his daughter up and took her upstairs to the bedroom where she slept at his mom's. They were going to have Christmas over here in the morning, so she'd spend the night here anyway. He tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and swept her hair away from her face. I love you, Zoe, he whispered, then turned out the light. She pulled her snuggly bear close to her, and he smiled, then closed the door partway. One beautiful girl down, one to go. Riley was still out, so he slid on the sofa next to her. Hey, Sleeping Beauty. She moaned, then turned on her side. Time to wake up. Don't wanna. He laughed, then nuzzled her neck with a kiss. You want to sleep on the couch tonight? You might get a peek at Santa. Or is it the cookies and milk you're after? She giggled. You've spoiled my master plan. She turned over and tunneled her fingers into his hair, pressing her lips against his. If you're going to start something, we should head to your place. Why? Because we're at my parents' and my mama's in the kitchen. Oh, good point. Okay. She pushed off his chest, yawned, and stretched. With her hair half sticking out of her ponytail and a sleepy look on her face, she was devastating to his senses. She stumbled into her boots, went into the kitchen to say goodnight to his mother, and they climbed into their coats. But instead of heading over to the B&B, he took her to his house. She turned to look at him when he pulled into the driveway. I wanted you to see my place. She smiled. I'd love to. It's nothing fancy, nothing like your house in Nashville. She reached for his hand. Ethan, don't compare Nashville and here. It's never about money. It's about home and what makes you happy. She opened the car door and stepped out, staring at the house. I wish it was daylight. Did you build the house? Yeah. It's lovely. I'm sure Amanda loved it. This isn't the house where Amanda and I lived. She turned to him, frowning. It's not? No. After she died, I wanted a fresh start. Didn't want those memories clouding mine and Zoe's life. Plus, the house we had was tiny, so I built this place. He tried to imagine what Riley would think of it. It wasn't oversized. It was a 2-story, gray and white, with a nice-sized backyard. I love all the trees, and the porch. I love porches. He opened the front door and turned the lights on, let Riley walk in. Oh, Ethan, this is nice. The marble tile is beautiful. Being in construction has its advantages. I get a lot of stuff at cost or not much markup, so I got to upgrade a lot. She was already steps ahead of him. This kitchen is magnificent. Double oven, granite counters. Ethan, I can't believe you built this. It's every woman's dream. He smiled at that. Glad you think so. My mom had some input into what she called a woman's dream kitchen. Riley turned around and leaned against the counter, folded her arms. She was right. The island, the pots and pans hanging over it, the sink in the island, the sub-zero freezer, everything you could want in a kitchen is in here. He couldn't help but feel pride at the work he'd done on the place. It's big enough for more than me and Zoe, and the yard is huge. He clicked on the back porch light. Zoe wants a dog. I've waited until she's old enough to be responsible. Oh, the yard is huge. I love the playset, and yes, it's perfect for a dog or two. I love animals. Always wished I could have some. He looked at her. I remember. I used to love playing with Jack, your lab. Yeah, he died a few years ago. Her smile vanished. I'm sorry. That must have been so hard on everyone. He was an old dog, and he lived a great life. We buried him in my parents' backyard by the big oak tree. Jack would have liked that. He loved sleeping under that tree. He took her hand and showed her the living room with its oversized couches and chairs and the giant television. Definitely a man's room, she teased. Hey, Zoe likes to watch Disney in here. She snorted. He led her upstairs. Only 2 of the bedrooms are in use. Oh, and there's a full bath and another bedroom or possible office downstairs. Haven't decided yet. So, 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms? Yeah. She stopped in the hallway. You planning on a couple more kids, maybe? I don't want Zoe to be an only child, so yeah, I'd like to have more kids someday. Something flickered in her eyes. That would be nice. Zoe would be a great big sister. This is Zoe's room. He opened the door and turned on the light. Riley laughed. Somehow I knew it would be pink. Very, very pink. I love her bed. Did you build that yourself? I did. She put her arm around him. It's beautiful, Ethan. Every little girl dreams of a canopy bed with a pink tulle canopy and fairy sparkles on the ceiling. Zoe loves her room, and thanks. She stepped in and took a look at the Noah's Ark of wooden carved animals on Zoe's dresser. These are amazing. Where did you get these? I made them. She swiveled, her mouth agape. You carved these? Yeah, I started when she was a baby before she was born. I made the ark first, then started on the animal pairs. I add to them every birthday. Oh, Ethan, they're gorgeous. The intricate workmanship in each piece and the level of detail. She ran her finger over the elephant's trunk. I hope Zoe treasures them. What a wonderful gift from father to daughter. He felt his cheeks burn hot, but admittedly enjoyed the praise. Thank you. She lingered at the Ark exhibit for a while, then stepped out of the room. He led her down the hall to his room. It's kind of sparse, just a giant bed and a dresser. She turned to him and smiled. How utterly perfect. Tired? He asked as he helped her remove her coat. I didn't think I was. I think little girls who snuggle against you have some kind of sleeping dust attached to them. Yeah, she does it to me too. It's the cuddle factor. Lethal. I was out before I knew what hit me. She held out her hand and he followed her to the bed. We didn't get much sleep last night, he reminded her. Her lips quirked. Guess what? We aren't going to get much tonight either. He pulled her against him, knowing he'd never tire of the feel of her curves pressed to his. Who needs sleep? He took his time undressing her, the frenzy of last night somewhat satisfied. Plus, there was something about taking a woman's clothes off, piece by piece, like unwrapping a gift without tearing the paper. He lifted her sweater over her head, had her sit on the bed and slipped her boots off, then her socks, before gently pushing her to the bed so he could pull off her pants. When he spied the golden silk and lace panties that matched the bra, he arched a brow. Prepared yourself tonight? I wasn't ready for you last night. I am tonight. These look expensive, he said, tracing his fingers around the tiny bows at her hips, then snaking his finger up her belly to the matching bow between her breasts. I'll try not to rip them. He felt the pounding of her heart beneath his fingers. Oh, I don't mind. I have plenty of lingerie. Do you? Yeah. It made him wonder why. He wanted to ask, but it wasn't his business. Not that any man's seen my underwear for a very long time, she said in answer to his unspoken question. I just have a thing for lingerie. His lips lifted. No woman's seen mine for a long time either, but the only lingerie I have a thing for is yours. She sat up and reached for the button of his jeans. How disappointing. And I was so hoping... Does Calvin count? She waited while he kicked his boots off, then drew his zipper down, her gaze meeting his as she shoved his jeans to the floor. Calvin definitely counts. When she helped him divest himself of his Calvins, he pulled his shirt off and climbed onto the bed, way more interested in what she was wearing. He smoothed his hands over the hills and valleys of her bra, paying attention to her breathing, the way her eyes went all glassy when her nipples peaked and hardened. He swept his fingers over the cups, seeing the buds of her nipples arching against the silk. Leaning over her, he took a taste of her through her bra. Ethan, she said, her voice soft and buttery as she slid her fingers into his hair. He drew the cups down to taste her, teasing her with his tongue in his mouth until she arched her hips against him, letting him know she was ready for more. Pleasuring her was so easy because she was so responsive with her body, and he loved touching her. He moved down her body and slid his hands over the silken softness of her panties, rewarded with a rush of unintelligible words from her lips. Ethan was pretty sure they were all good words as he slid his hand inside her panties and took her to the edge, watching her face as she came apart for him, shuddering out a cry that held his name. She was undoing him with every minute he spent with her. When she took off her bra and panties and climbed on top of him, taking control, he might have died a little. And when she leaned over, her breast sliding against his chest as she took his mouth and claimed him at the same time she took possession of him with her body, he knew for sure she was his, always had been and always would be, and neither time nor distance had ever changed that, or ever would. She held his hands and rocked against him, and he couldn't remember ever being with a woman who surprised him, challenged him, or made him question his priorities more. And when they came, together, both of them holding tight to each other, the darkness of night, he knew then that no matter what, he was never going to let her go. Because, for the first time in his life, he wondered just what he'd be willing to give up to have Riley in his life forever. After, they held each other in the dark, both of them quiet for a while. Ethan, she finally whispered. Yeah? This time we've had together has been really amazing. Yeah, it has. His gut tightened. This might be an "it's been great, but" kind of speech. I wish it could last forever. Me too, Riley. He waited, but she didn't say anything else, making him wonder if she hesitated because she didn't want to hurt him, or if she was waiting for him to make the next move. Hell, he'd never been very good at figuring out what women thought or what they wanted. It took a while before he realized she'd fallen asleep. While she slept, he got up and wandered the house, wondering how he was going to approach this, how he'd ever ask her to stay with him. Hour after hour he walked from room to room, realizing he'd be asking her to make all the sacrifices. He'd be giving up nothing, and she'd have to give up everything, or at least make a hell of a lot of adjustments in her life. Great for him, not so great for her. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. Maybe the best thing he could do for her was let her go, instead of presenting her with a no-win scenario, because it was his only option, which meant what he had to offer her was really nothing special. Really, nothing at all. Chapter 9. Ethan woke Riley early the next morning, like before dawn kind of early. He said he had to get over to his parents to be there before Zoe woke up so they could do the whole gifts and Santa thing. He wanted to take her with him, but Riley thought it would be best if he had Christmas morning alone with his daughter. Plus, there was something she had to do, so she told him she was going to go back to the B&B, take a shower and change clothes, and then she'd drive over to his parents'. She'd read his hesitancy last night, and at first she was hurt. She'd been hoping for some kind of declaration from him. She thought she knew how he felt, knew for sure how she felt, and was determined not to be the first to say something. But she realized she held the upper hand now, that the situation wasn't at all the same now as it had been 10 years ago. He wasn't going to ask her to stay. Not now, not when he knew she had so much at stake. Silly men and their egos. Didn't he realize she was in love with him? And love always trumped everything, especially money and career. At least it did with her. And when you were in love, the rest of it could be worked out. Not that she had any intention of walking away from her career. She wasn't stupid. But she had an idea. So when Ethan dropped her off, she ran upstairs and took a shower and dressed, then grabbed her guitar and got to work. It took a few hours, but she finally had everything figured out. She'd already been working on it for days, she realized. She loaded the gift she'd bought into the car and drove over to Ethan's parents' house. Brody opened the door and grabbed her, planting a short but deep kiss on her lips. "Merry Christmas, Riley," he said, clearly already deep into the rum punch. She laughed. "Merry Christmas, Brody." He carried the gifts into the house for her while she greeted everyone. Zoe ran up and hugged her, waved some kind of fancily dressed doll in front of her face, then dashed off to play with all her new stuff, as she called it, but extracted a promise from Riley that she'd come see all her presents as soon as she got settled and said hello. "Coffee, hot chocolate, or rum punch?" Ethan's mother asked. "Actually, a cup of coffee sounds great, thanks." "With or without brandy or whiskey in it?" Ethan's dad asked as he came up and hugged her. "Oh, now you're tempting me. How about a little brandy?" "There's a girl after my own heart." "There's a girl who'll be face down on the floor before lunch," Ethan said. "Merry Christmas, Riley." He pulled her into his arms and planted what Riley considered to be one seriously hot kiss on her lips, in front of his parents and his brothers. "Daddy, you kissed Riley!" And his daughter. He broke the kiss and grinned at his daughter. "I did. Is that okay?" Zoe nodded. "Yep. Will you come take my game out of the package?" "Sure, honey." He shifted his gaze to Riley. "Sorry, dad duty calls. Back in a sec." Apparently, Zoe was utterly unfazed about the kiss between her and Ethan, one hurdle down. And as she surveyed his parents and his brother, Wyatt just shrugged, Ethan's mother beamed a smile, and his father grinned from ear to ear as he poured what Riley considered a face-down-on-the-floor-before-lunch dose of brandy into her coffee. "You trying to get me drunk, Mr. Kent?" He laughed and smacked her on the back. "Nah, figured you're a tough girl and you can take it. Drink up, it'll put hair on your chest." Now there's an unattractive visual. Wyatt grumbled, taking the bottle of whiskey and pouring it straight into the glass with a couple ice cubes. "Too early for that, Wyatt," his mother warned. Wyatt kissed Mrs. Kent on the cheek. "I'm here, isn't that enough?" "I suppose, but that's all the whiskey you get today. Switch off to coffee after that." Wyatt nodded, but Riley caught the roll of his eyes as he walked away. "He's had it rough the past couple years," she explained to Riley after he walked out. "But I sure wish he'd get over Cassandra, stop with the bitterness, and move on with his life." "With some people, it takes a while." "You talking about yourself?" Riley laughed. "I guess so. I carried a grudge for a long time. But now you're over it." "I did it all wrong, Mrs. Kent. Stacey. I wish I had known then what I know now. I would have done things differently." Ethan's mother held up her hands. "No way to change the past or predict the future. I made a mistake in running. I should have stood my ground and fought for Ethan." She smiled. "I'm glad to hear you say that. Did you tell him that?" "Not exactly." Mrs. Kent rolled her eyes. "Hell's bells, what is it with you kids not telling each other how you feel? You're talking to the wrong person. Go. Go tell my son you love him." Riley smiled. "I will. Sometime today, I promise." She gave Ethan's mother a quick hug, then wandered out to find Ethan. He was on the floor with Zoe, who was playing a handheld game while Ethan frowned over instructions. "It says, to reach level 2... "I'm already on level 4, Daddy," Zoe said, not looking up from her game. "Oh." Ethan tossed the instructions in the pile of trash. Riley laughed. "Technology is for children, you know." She sat down on the floor on the other side of Zoe. "So I'm beginning to understand." Riley watched Zoe play the game for a while, then Zoe handed it over to Riley to play. She figured it out after a few rather embarrassing tries, and Zoe showing her how it was done. Then she realized she wanted one of these handheld game devices, especially when Ethan showed her the catalog of software that went with it. It has cooking recipes. It tells you step-by-step instructions while you're cooking, and here I thought it was a kid's device. "It's multifunctional for all ages," Zoe said. Riley looked at Ethan, then at Zoe. "How old are you again, kid?" 7. "Are you sure? You're awfully smart for 7. Zoe giggled. "That's what my daddy says, too." Riley excused herself to help Mrs. Kent set the table for lunch. They ate an abundance of turkey and dressing, with more side dishes than Riley could count. It was the best holiday home-cooked meal she'd had in ages. After they cleared the table and loaded the dishwasher, it was time to sit in the living room, and Riley handed out the gifts she'd bought for everyone. She'd bought Wyatt and Brody new coats, thick down ones that would be great for the job site. She gave Mr. and Mrs. Kent a new television because they'd been complaining their old one was about to give up the ghost. She gave Zoe a guitar, and the little girl's eyes widened. Then she squealed. "Really?" "You're old enough, but you'll have to take lessons." "I'll practice every day. I want to play like you do." "You have a beautiful voice, Zoe, but you only have to play guitar if that's what you want to do. Otherwise, it can just sit in your room and you can look at it and think of me." She grinned. "Cool." "Now, I have a gift for you," Ethan said, interrupting her. "It's not as nice as the gifts you gave my family, but I've been working on it for the past 10 years. She tilted her head to the side. "You have?" "Yeah. You seeing Zoe's room last night reminded me, so I finished it today." He handed her a box. She opened it, and inside was a carving much like the ones of Zoe's Noah's Ark animals, only it was a woman sitting on a stool with a guitar. "It looks just like you, Riley, when you're singing and playing your guitar," Zoe said. Riley's eyes filled with tears. She lifted her gaze to Ethan. "It does. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's the best gift ever." Ethan leaned over and brushed his lips over hers. "I love you, Riley. I always have. I always will." I don't have much to offer, but what I have is yours. A home, a family, my love, forever. I want you with me. I want you to be a part of my life." Her heart swelled and soared. The words she needed to hear made joy spring from every pore, from every fiber of her body. She sniffed, fighting back the tears. "I have a gift for you as well, Ethan." She went to get her guitar. "I thought about what it meant to come back here again, to come back and see you again. But now I realize that seeing you was what I needed and what I wanted the most, and also what I was most afraid of. I ran once, but I want you to know I'm never running again, no matter how hard it gets. I love you, Ethan." She started the song, the music perfectly clear in her head, soft melody, heart-filled strains of love pouring from her guitar as she sang only to the man she loved, a slow, sweet melody, a pouring out of her heart, her very soul, for Ethan. The swing out back where we'd talk for hours. You'd smile, I'd blush, the world was ours. Back then I didn't know all I had. I threw it all away when it all went black. Girlish dreams are glitter and polish, up in smoke without a backwards glance. You gave me your heart, then you let me go. I thought you didn't care. I didn't know. You set me free to give me a chance. I took my heart with me and never looked back. I hurt you then because I didn't see what it was you did for me. I was blind and foolish on my own. The lights were bright, it was all for show, lonely nights, years on the road. It's not enough anymore. I want to come home. The world's a big place with so much to see. I've learned a lot. I soared and was free. But the tie still remains, drawing me here. And now I stand next to you without fear. The soul knows who lights the flame of love and desire. I know his name. I don't want to run. I don't want to roam. I want to come home. I want to come home. My wandering ends, but our journey begins. All it takes is for you to let me in. Open the door and give me your love. I want to come home. I want to come home to you. The room fell silent, and Mrs. Kent cleared her throat. "That was lovely, Riley. Now, the rest of you can come help me in the kitchen." "But, Grandma, I want to hear Riley sing some more." "Later, Zoe. Riley and your daddy have some talking to do." "Riley, do you love my daddy?" Riley turned a tear-filled gaze to Zoe. "Yes, Zoe, I do love your daddy." Zoe grinned. "I thought so. That's pretty cool because he loves you too, don't you, Daddy?" Riley turned back to Ethan to see him nodding at his daughter. "Yes, Muffin, I do love Riley." "That's so cool. My daddy loves Riley Jensen." Riley laughed through her tears. After everyone left, Ethan came over to her, took her guitar, and laid it against the sofa. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a deep kiss filled with all the love she'd always wanted but was afraid she'd never have. And when he broke the kiss, he said, "I was afraid to ask you to stay. I couldn't ask it of you. I'll have to travel. I was afraid to ask that sacrifice of you. I love my career. I'd never make you give it up. Zoe and I can travel with you in the summers." "You do that?" "I'd do anything for you." She smiled, then laughed, put her hands around his neck. "Anything?" "Yes." "Will you give me babies to fill that huge house of yours?" He arched a brow. "How soon do you want them?" "Really soon." "Then I guess I'd better put a ring on your finger and marry you really soon." "I love you, Ethan." "I love you too, Riley." As Ethan kissed her, and then as her family, because they were all her family now, crowded in to offer congratulations, she realized she'd been given all she wanted for Christmas. The man she loved, a beautiful daughter, a family who would always be hers, and love. The best gift of all was always love.
Unwrapped. Written by Megan Hart and read by Savannah Richards.
This was Beauty. The line of his spine curved at the top where his head had bent, his hands clasped behind him. Not bound, though he'd have allowed that if she wanted it. Lee didn't have to bind Brandon to keep him where she wanted him to stay. And besides, eventually she was going to have use for his hands. More beauty in the fall of his hair over his forehead, hiding his eyes. She could see the lift of his smile, though. The rise and fall of his shoulders as he drew in a breath when she shifted a little in the satin-bottomed chair in front of him. A fire burned in the see-through glass fireplace, separating the bedroom and bathroom, but the room wasn't overly warm. Still, sweat glistened on his upper lip. If she licked his mouth just now, she'd taste the salt of him. Instead, Lee parted her knees a little more. Brandon. She let herself take in another few seconds of admiring gaze, almost daring him to bend a little. Soften his stance. But he didn't. Just stayed with his back straight, his head bent, on his knees. Hands placed wrist over wrist behind him at the small of his back. Look at me. He did, with a little shake of his head to get the hair from his eyes. She smiled. He did too. But he didn't move, because she hadn't told him he should. His cock thickened, though, telling her he was ready. More than ready. Eager. His tongue slid across his lips again, and her clit pulsed in response. Though he was naked, Lee wore what she liked to call the wet dream ensemble. Lingerie, and not the silky, comfortable sort she usually preferred. Oh, no. Today she wore a pair of crotchless panties and a bra that left her nipples exposed. Garter belt and sheer seamed stockings. Also a pair of ridiculously high heels she'd packed in her suitcase, even though they took up space, and she'd only ever wear them for moments like this. Brandon had confessed to her that along with dirty talk, the filthier the better. He'd grown to have a new appreciation for CFNM. Clothed female, naked male. It wasn't quite a fetish. Lee wasn't sure either one of them really had any fetishes. Sure, their sex life wasn't what could normally be called vanilla, and she knew more than many of her friends about the delights of playing with dominance and submission. But a fetish seemed like something so strong you couldn't get off without it. So far, she'd been thrilled to find there wasn't anything that held either of them back from finding pleasure in whatever they did. Several months ago, she'd left him a catalog with instructions that he was to go through and circle whatever he liked best. It had led to an extremely sexy evening of fun, but she hadn't mentioned it since then and suspected her husband had probably forgotten the task entirely until walking into the bedroom an hour ago and seeing her dressed this way. It wasn't anything she'd ever have picked for herself, but his drop jaw and wide eyes had been worth every cent. The smooth fabric of the chair caressed her skin as she arched against the chair's ornate back and opened her legs wider. She slid her hand down over her breasts, nipples already tight, and over her belly. Between her legs. She slipped a fingertip inside the panties' frilly edges. She was wet. Had been for 20 minutes, teasing him, teasing herself. She circled her finger against her clit, letting out an entirely unfeigned and unrestrained sigh. The muscles of her thighs and belly jumped at the sensation. Brandon's gaze caught each and every tremble and twitch. His shoulders rose and fell again as his throat worked against a swallow. His lips parted, but though she saw the press of his tongue against his teeth and his mouth formed what might have been a word, he cut himself off from it. She told him he was not allowed to speak until she gave him permission. Not that she didn't love his voice or hearing him talk, because she did. Of all the things she loved about him, Brandon's ability to hold his own in conversation with her was one of them. And he liked to talk. He liked to listen, too. This was beauty, Lee thought, watching him remind himself not to say anything. This was power. And most of all, it was love. "It's been a couple days since you ate my pussy," she murmured, watching for the telltale blaze of interest in Brandon's deep, dark eyes. For a man who could look as innocent as a choir boy, he surely did get off on dirty talk. She circled her clit again, opened her legs wider to give him a better look at just what she was offering. "I think we'll start with that." He made a noise. Not off limits, according to the rules she'd set out for him. She'd left a short but precise list for him to find on the condo's front door after he returned from a run to the convenience store for snacks. She recognized the sound. Frustrated arousal, low and deep in his throat. She laughed a little, watching him press his lips together against whatever it was he meant to say. She slipped off her shoes and shifted her ass to the very edge of the chair, then stretched out one leg to press her foot against his bare shoulder. Toes he'd painted bright red for her just that morning flexed in the stockings as she traced the line of his collarbone with them. She let her foot slide down just an inch or so to press the heel to his heart. The steady, strong thumping sent an answering thud to her own pulse. "I want your mouth on me." "Just," she cautioned as he shifted eagerly to move toward her. "Your mouth." Brandon groaned, still smiling, but closed his eyes and let his head drop a moment before looking back up at her with a raised brow. Lee laughed again, still rubbing gently at her clit, keeping herself on edge. Was he going to break the agreement? But no. Despite a heavy sigh and another look, Brandon moved forward without unclasping his hands from behind him. When he got within touching distance of the chair, though, he took his hands from behind him and mimed holding on to the edges of the chair with an exaggerated look of innocence. Then he twiddled his fingers and looked up, then down to the spot on the floor next to her chair and mimed, falling over. Lee snorted softly at how he was managing to get around her instructions, and narrowed her eyes, though they both knew she wasn't even close to irritated. "Fine, but only the chair. You can't use your hands on me. Not yet." His eyes widened and so did his grin. Brandon gripped the chair to either side of her ass and bent to nuzzle at her thigh, twisting his head to look up at her as he did it. All puppy eyes and pretended purity, but she knew better. "Mouth only," she warned in a voice gone husky with the desire he fed so perfectly inside her. "And don't touch yourself, either." Brandon's gaze went dark just before he closed his eyes and kissed the inside of her thigh, bare above the top of her stocking. She felt the hot, slick weight of his tongue on her sensitive flesh. He moved closer to her cunt, his breath gusting on her arousal. He gave no tentative flick with his tongue, no hesitating press of his lips. He kissed her clit just the way she liked it. Lips and the press of teeth behind them, firm. Then a slow, steady pressure with his tongue. This was one of those situations where it was rapidly becoming unclear who, exactly, suffered by restricting the use of his hands. Certainly, if she hadn't told him he couldn't use his hands, Brandon would have slid a finger or two inside her by now. But even as the thought of it tipped her head back and shifted her hips forward against his eager mouth, Lee knew that it was the thought that he could but would not that was getting her hot and wet and stiffening his cock. "Fuck, I love you," she said, under her breath. She tangled her fingers in his thick dark hair, holding him in place, though it wasn't like he was making any attempt to get away. Brandon hummed against her cunt, another familiar noise of pleasure Lee adored. He didn't need words for her to understand him, but she knew that, while she might have restricted his voice as thoroughly as the use of his hands, one of Brandon's turn-ons was hearing her talk. So she did. "I love it when you lick my clit, just like that. Suck it a little." Her breath caught when he obeyed. "Oh, God, Brandon." He made that low noise again, and the rhythm of his tongue on her clit faltered just for a second. She looked down at him, could see only closed eyes, the bridge of his nose. His lips and tongue worked against her, and it felt so fucking good she could almost ignore the way her ass was sliding on the slippery chair seat. How she was going to slide right off in another second if she weren't careful. It was too awkward to hitch herself up a little higher, and the fact she'd chosen this chair precisely because it had no arms to get in the way of their fucking meant that now she had nothing to grab onto to stop herself. The edge of it now caught her just above the crack of her ass, pressing unpleasantly. Lee rocked her hips a little, shivering at how good that felt as she rubbed herself on Brandon's face, but all too quickly wondering what she was going to do when she ended up on the floor. She didn't need to worry. Just as she started to fall, his big hands gripped her hips and not only held her steady, but eased her just high enough on the chair seat that she was once more safe. He looked up at her as he did, his mouth still firmly fastened between her legs, but both brows raised in a silent question. Lee let go of his hair. "I should have known you wouldn't let me fall." Brandon lifted his mouth, glistening from her flesh. "Does this mean I can talk now, too?" She laughed a little breathlessly and smoothed a fingertip over his brows. "No. Use your mouth for other things." "Hands, though?" He paused, giving her a deliberately cheesy, if entirely sexy look. "Please?" "Since you asked, so—" "Oh, fuck, that's good." He hadn't waited for her to finish, but simply shifted just enough that he could put his mouth back on her clit, flicking it with his tongue while his lips expertly worked the hood, and pressed 2 fingers inside her at the same time. Lee wasn't close enough to coming that the added sensation tipped her over, but the way he did it, so smooth, just right, certainly sent an uprush of pleasure through her. The chair creaked and she stifled a somewhat wild giggle at the thought she might still end up on the floor, this time in a shower of splintered wood. "Stop," she breathed, turned on and pleased by how he immediately did what she asked. This was another sort of beauty. The way that, no matter how turned on he was or what he was doing, he was still so attuned to her that a simple command could stop him in his tracks. Lee pushed him gently away, and he allowed her without even a protest, though he did give her a quizzical look. It changed a second later when she stood and shoved the chair out of the way. "On your back." The carpet in this room was thick and plush and soft. It was why she hadn't felt guilty at all about having him on his knees for so long, even though she knew too well from past experience that old soccer injuries made that position not the best for him. Still, it was better having him stretch out on his back in front of her, that thick, delicious cock now so tantalizingly hard she almost got on her own knees to take it in her mouth. Almost. Not quite. Though on the surface, all of this, the list, the commands, might seem to be solely for her pleasure. The fact was that she'd instrumented this scenario because of how expertly it would flip Brandon's switch. Standing, she straddled his hips and looked into his face. His hands rested lightly on her ankles. His eyes met hers without looking away, and she fell into the love she saw there. Love and anticipation, mirrored in the way he licked his mouth and let his gaze dip just for a second down to her pussy before going back up to hers, He was waiting for her. Lee cocked a hip, eyeing him up and down, letting him wonder just what she meant to do. She dragged her toes up his side, tickling him a little, watching him laugh but not wiggle enough to lose the grip he'd retaken on her other ankle. She rested her foot again on his heart, never hard enough to hurt or even weigh him too fiercely. Brandon. She'd learned a lot of his triggers over the past 2 years, ones he hadn't even known he had. But his name would always be one of the strongest for both of them. He drew in a breath. His fingers tightened just briefly on her ankle. He opened his mouth to reply, and she shook her head, reminding him of the list. He pressed his lips together on a smile, gaze flaring. "I told you I wanted you to use your mouth for other things," she reminded softly, circling her toes against his skin before settling her foot carefully next to his chest, just below his arm. This position stretched her wide, gave him an unobstructed view of her open pussy. In another moment, she'd taken another step to put herself directly over him. She knelt over his face, her cunt scant inches from his mouth, and slid her fingers over his forehead and through his hair to tug his head back just the smallest amount. Lee thought she had more to say, but found no words. Action had to suffice. She shifted forward, her knees pressing and her hands finding the softness of the carpet. She angled herself over his mouth just right. Close enough he didn't have to strain to reach her, but not pressing down on him. Oh, fuck, that was so sweet. Being able to rock herself in any direction, using his mouth for the friction, but controlling the direction, the pace. All of it set her on a swift path to orgasm. She didn't come yet, though. They didn't play at orgasm denial, and certainly never for punishment, but teasing herself to draw out the pleasure? Yes, thank you. Now, this close, she wanted to give him his voice. "Talk to me, Brandon." "I love eating your pussy," he murmured against her, lifting his head to follow her when she eased herself up half an inch. "I want to get lost in it." She laughed softly, his words silly and sexy at the same time, the way most fuck talk sounded. "Do you?" Given permission to speak, he must have figured hands were okay too, because now he moved them to grip her hips and hold her in place. "Yes." He licked her slowly, ending with a slow, small circle of her clit. "I could stay here all day, just like this." "All day?" She breathed out to keep her voice steady. No small feat since she was having trouble stopping the moans struggling to burst out of her. "That's a long time." "All day," he assured her, voice muffled. He licked her again, then sucked gently, winning that moan from her at last. "I'd make you come so many times you'd lose count." "Oh, would you?" Lee, eyes closed, dug her fingers into the thick carpet and held herself very, very still, letting the movement of his mouth as he spoke to her do all the work. All it would take was a few more whispers, a sentence, maybe only half of one, and she was going to come. "Maybe we could just start with one," Brandon offered helpfully, and then did that thing with his lips and tongue he was so good at, the one she could never quite picture or figure out what he was doing because it always sent her tipping fast and furious over the edge into those few fluttering moments of oblivion that came from a truly spectacular orgasm. Pleasure rippled through her, and she no longer worried about holding back her moan, about holding anything back, really. Everything she had, she gave up to him in that moment, and the freedom of that was as much a part of the pleasure as anything he'd been doing to her with his mouth. Giving up to him, surrendering her pleasure to him, letting him do this for her. This was beauty, too. Blinking, she pushed up on her hands as her body still shook. then slid down his body to capture his mouth with hers. For the moment, she could only focus on the hard thickness of his cock between them and the warmth of his mouth on hers. One hand went beneath his neck to dig into the softness of his hair at the base of his skull. She ground her cunt on his cock, already rising toward another orgasm, and wondering if she ought to let it happen this way, or if she wanted to slide onto him. Maybe she could try for both. But no. That would be greedy, wouldn't it? "I think," she said into his ear, bending over him to lick at the lobe, "I want to fuck you now." "Great," he said, in a rumbling, hoarse voice. "Little help?" She loved that they could laugh together. "What, you can't manage?" "The sooner you help me, the sooner I can be inside you," he said, wriggling under her, still half-trapped by her cunt pushing down on his cock. Good point. She lifted so he could shift. He was already gripping the base of his cock, ready to guide it inside her as she eased herself onto him. "Fuck," Brandon breathed, and Lee's cunt clutched at him in response to the way his voice dipped under the word. She had triggers too. She settled herself onto him the whole way, letting out a small groan when his cock nudged her cervix. It was almost too much, but she blew out a breath and rocked against the pressure to shift him inside her. She gripped him with her knees to hold him still, though she felt the muscles in his sides working to move his hips. Lee put her hands on Brandon's shoulders, her fingers curling into his skin. Her hair fell down around his face as her mouth found his. "Now," she breathed. "Brandon, fuck me now." And he did. Oh, God, he did it just right. In, out, his hips twisting just enough. Her clit pressed his belly with every thrust, and she tightened her inner muscles against the sliding pressure of his cock inside her. The urgency had eased off, but she was going to come again. No question, no stopping it. Their bodies moved together, stuttering just once or twice before he found his rhythm. Now Lee let him set the pace, going with it. She thought, given how long she'd been teasing him, that he'd start off fast and get faster. But Brandon had a way of surprising her no matter how well she thought she knew him. He didn't ram his cock in and out of her, not frantic. He went slow. His tongue stroked hers and captured her gasp. "I want you to come again, baby." She couldn't finish the sentence, finding no words. Hard to speak, hard to focus on anything but this great and building sweep of pleasure washing over her. He fucked into her a little harder, a little faster, but still careful. Not too hard, not too fast. She loved him for that. Even as her orgasm shattered through her and she needed, wanted, no, craved the sensation of him moving inside her. "Faster," she breathed into his mouth and clutched at his hair to tip his head so she could get at the sweetness of his throat. His groan sent waves of pleasure rippling through her. When she bit lightly at his throat, she swore she felt the throb of his cock inside her. And though it might be her imagination, the idea that he was so close to coming pushed her into climax. Lee came, tasting the salt-sweet flavor of his flesh between her teeth, and released his throat from her mouth as she gasped his name over and over. Some minutes, or maybe it was an hour, went by. She couldn't be sure. She was so thoroughly wiped out. At last, blinking, she pushed herself up to look into his face. His eyes were closed, but that broad grin was still on his lovely mouth. She kissed him lightly. "Hey." He didn't open his eyes. "Hey." "Did I kill you?" "I'm sort of a little dead, yeah." Brandon cracked open one eye to squint at her. "But it's okay." Lee sat up, feeling him soften inside her, but not willing to move off of him just yet. The bathroom was a goodly number of steps away, and she wasn't ready for the hopping, post-sex, trying not to leak until I get to the shower dance. Besides, she loved these moments too. Just after they'd both had the tops of their heads blown off in orgasm, when she could look at him all sleepy and sated-looking and marvel at how lucky she was to have such a sexy, wonderful husband. "What?" he asked, both eyes open now. "Nothing." "What?" Brandon looked concerned. "Were you going to cry?" Lee blinked, surprised to find there was, indeed, the small sting of tears in the back of her eyes. He noticed everything about her. "No. Well, maybe a little. But not in a bad way." Brandon sat up and hitched himself closer to her. "Uh-oh." Lee laughed. "It's not bad, really." "Is this one of those tears of joy things?" He gave her a serious look. She kissed him. "Absolutely." He grinned at the kiss. "Okay, good. So, dinner now?" "So predictable," Lee murmured and ran her hand through his hair before kissing him again. She rested her forehead against his for a second. "Yes, dinner now." The beauty of staying in a ski-in, ski-out condo in Vail was that it made it easy to get to the slopes. They'd even had some groceries pre-delivered by a specialty service, so they'd have food for breakfast and some dinners. But Lee didn't feel like cooking, and suspected that though Brandon would be happy to make her something if she asked, he wouldn't be that enthused about the idea either. She kissed him again and got up to head for the shower, saying over her shoulder, "Mexican?" "You sure?" He got up to follow her. "I thought you said we were going to stick to our budget." "I know what I said, but—" Lee shrugged as she turned on the shower. "What's money for if not to spend?" He snorted lightly at that, and she knew why. Planning a wedding, even a simple one, after she'd lost her job due to corporate downsizing, had caused them both quite a bit of stress. But with new jobs for both of them, it had all worked out. Enough for them to feel comfortable booking this vacation. Their first Christmas together as a married couple. Surely, eating a few dinners out couldn't be that bad. "I won't say no to Mexican," Brandon said as she stripped quickly and stepped into the shower. The familiar jangle of his cell phone filtered through from the bedroom. "I bet that's my mom. Let me grab it and I'll join you in a few minutes." It could be longer than that, if Caroline got to talking. So Lee just shook her head, but fondly. Brandon's loving parents were a little overwhelming for a woman whose own family prided itself on distance and independence. But Caroline had really come through for Lee when she needed her. There was room in Brandon's life for both of them, even if it meant being a little late for dinner. "Take your time," she told him from under the spray. "Give her my love." This was the good life. A plate of tortilla chips and some salsa, a bottle of Corona, a plate of quesadillas on the way, some great live music, and his wife sitting next to him, chair dancing to the music. The restaurant they'd picked was crowded, which meant getting friendly with their neighbors. The blonde beside him had the annoying habit of tossing her hair when she laughed. But Brandon was already thigh to thigh with Lee and couldn't ask her to shift over without pushing her up against the table full of frat boys at the table on her other side. The table directly across from them had a couple with 2 small children. Small, loud children who didn't seem to like Mexican food. "This is so good!" Lee cried, dipping her chip in the salsa and holding her hand beneath to catch any drips. "Good choice, Mr. Long." Brandon tipped his bottle toward her. "You chose it, Mrs. Long." She leaned close to kiss him with the spicy salsa still on her lips, and he caught the glint in her gaze that stirred his cock even though they'd just had epic sex not more than a couple hours ago. Her hand slid along his thigh to cup him below the cover of the tablecloth. "Am I going to regret it later, though?" Brandon shifted just as the blonde swung her hair again. It hit his shoulder, so he turned his back, hoping to prevent any getting in his face. "I can't make any promises." Lee stroked him through his jeans, gave him a gentle squeeze, and sat back. Uh-huh. Ah, well, I'll just open the windows. The toddler at the next table spilled a full glass, then began to scream. The parents, looking haggard and irritated, waved for the waitress to bring some extra napkins, while the baby pounded relentlessly on the high-chair tray. Lee gave the family a raised-brow glance Brandon was glad wasn't directed at him. "I'd cry too," she said, "if I was out in a noisy, crowded place past my bedtime." Brandon had been to plenty of dinners with his brothers' families and felt the same. "People shouldn't bring their kids to restaurants." Lee turned to look at him. "I wouldn't go that far." "Kids are messy. They're loud and they can't sit still," he said matter-of-factly. "They'll only eat chicken fingers or grilled cheese, and they usually have to go to the bathroom at the wrong time." "Well, that's true, but—" She looked again at the family, which had calmed down, even though both parents were now muttering and glaring at each other over their salsa and chips. "Look at those people," he said. "They're miserable." "I thought you liked kids." "I love kids," Brandon said. Kids of his own would be different, he guessed. And sure, he wanted to be a dad, sooner rather than later, though he was pretty sure Lee wasn't ready to talk about having babies. Not with her new job and all. Plus, they'd only been married a few months. Her brow furrowed for a moment as her gaze cut to the family's table again. "I guess it's easy to say what you do differently with your own." The servers brought 2 trays of food and began passing them out to the frat boys at the table next door. Then put 2 plates on Brandon and Lee's table. Lee forked a bite of steak and peppers and offered it to Brandon, who took it off her fork with his mouth. "How's your quesadilla?" He hadn't yet taken a bite, but did now. "Good. Want some?" She waggled her brows. "Of course." Together they shared the contents of their plates. The music made conversation difficult, not that it mattered. At least it blocked out the noise from the cranky kids at the next table. And besides, Brandon and Lee didn't always have to talk in order to communicate. "That was delish." Lee patted her stomach with a sigh as they left the restaurant, music still blaring behind them. The doors they'd just come through opened at once, spilling out the frat guys. "What now?" "I know. Let's go work off all this food." "I like the sound of that," he said with a grin and pulled her closer. But Lee laughed and shook her head. "Not that way. Well, maybe later that way. I just figured we have the week passes, and what's the use of ski in and ski out if we don't, well, ski in?" Brandon, his hands settled on her hips, turned them both to face the broad expanse of brightly lit mountain behind them. "I thought you didn't like night skiing." "I don't, but you do." This was true. Lee didn't love to ski the way he did. She was decently skilled, enough to keep up with him if he slowed himself down, but she didn't like to go too fast, and even though he thought she was good enough to hit the Black Diamond slopes, she preferred to stick with green and blue. She didn't like to ski at night because the lights messed with her depth perception. "It was that second margarita, huh?" He kissed her, then looked again at the mountain. He did like skiing at night, had been willing to forego it for her. But if she was serious, "I just want you to have a good time on this trip, that's all." She gestured at the mountain. "And we should get our money's worth out of the passes. And maybe—" Brandon looked at her. "Maybe what?" "Maybe it gets me a little tingly watching you on the slopes." He grinned. "Yeah?" "You're so athletic," Lee said, smiling but serious, "and graceful. You just swoosh, swoosh down the hill. And I'm always behind you, so I get a great view of your ass." "I'm not going to argue with you then." "Sure, why not? Let's go. The slopes don't shut down for another couple hours. We can do a few runs. Maybe hit the hot tub later, too." His wife stood on her toes to grin up at him. Absolutely. Lee was a big believer in stopping while you were still having fun. She should have stopped before they started. It had seemed like a great idea after dinner, which admittedly had been eased along by 2 very good margaritas. But she couldn't blame alcohol for it. Not really. She'd been serious when she said watching Brandon ski was a turn-on. Watching him do most anything was, but watching him be all sporty and athletic most definitely melted her butter. Lee was a competent skier, snorkeler, horseback rider, whatever. But Brandon, all long legs and broad shoulders and big hands, was perfection in motion. "You okay?" He dug one pole into the hard-packed snow, his skis angled just right. "We don't have to do this, you know. We could take the blue slope." "No. You said this one wasn't so bad after this first drop-off, right?" Lee gave the steep hill in front of them a wary glance. She was far more comfortable on wide slopes where she could zigzag and keep her speed down. But in order to get to that bit, she'd have to navigate this drop in front of her. She could do it. Probably. But she wasn't really looking forward to it. "Let's go down the other way," Brandon said. "I don't care, Lee. Really." She looked up at him. They'd only been